Good evening. Will the Planning and Zoning Commission meeting of January 15th, 2020 please come to order? As this is a public meeting, it will be videotaped. We will ask persons who wish to speak to state their name and address for the record. First, we will have the applicant explain what is being requested. Second, we will have questions from commissioners. Then we will ask for comments of support from people in the audience. Next, we will ask for people who are opposed to speak. Seated this evening are Sean Cosgrove, Matt Yerzinski, Rich Wallace, I'm Phil Johnson, Alan Brown, Jason Marchi, Jamie Stein, Frank DeAndrea, Scott Edmonds just showed up. Thank you. Town staff is George Call. We have Aaron Mannix. Our recording secretary is Lisa Piombino. And Peter Schultz is our recording secretary. Decisions of this board can be appealed to Superior Court within 15 days. Decisions will be available at the Planning and Zoning Commission. I believe the number is 453-8039. Will the secretary read the legal notice?
Notice is hereby given that the Guilford Planning and Zoning Commission will hold a public hearing on January 15th, 2020 at 7:30 p.m. at location Nathaniel B. Green Community Center, 32 Church Street, Guilford, Connecticut, Monunketuck Room, 2nd floor, for the following purposes. Deborah Whitcomb, 103 Shell Beach Road, map 13, lot 9, zone R1, coastal site plan to lift the seasonal cottage to make it FEMA compliant. Mark Lazarus, 162 Daniel Avenue, map 10, lot 164, zone R2, coastal site plan and special permit to remodel house, add new garage, driveway, sidewalks, and utilities. Copies of these applications are available for inspection in the office of the Planning and Zoning Commission, Town Hall, South 50 Boston Street, Guilford, Connecticut. At this hearing, persons may attend and be heard, and written communication will be received. Dated Guilford, Connecticut, this 20th day of December 2019. Phil Johnson, Chair.
Thank you very much. For anyone that's here for the Deborah Whitcomb application, that has been tabled to the 5th of February. So just bringing that up. So our first public hearing item is Mark Lazarus, 162 Daniel Ave, map 10, lot 164, zone R2, coastal site plan and special permit to remodel house, add new garage, driveway, sidewalks, and utilities. Would someone like to make a motion to table the first applications to the 5th?
Second.
All in favor?
All right.
Thank you.
Good. Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission. For the record, my name is Michael Harkin. I'm a professional engineer and principal of Harkin Engineering, located at 78 Wolf Hollow Lane in the town of Killingworth, Connecticut. Again, here tonight on behalf of our client, Mark Lazarus, at 162 Daniel Ave. Mark is in the audience now. He came up from New York to attend the meeting. Again, also with me is Mr. Russell Campaign from CK Architects, who will be going over the special permit and the house and the physical garage design. So my task in the project was for the CAM application. What you see in front of you is the CAM soil and erosion control plan. It's very basic. We're proposing a 24 by 26 garage towards the front of the property. The existing house is going to remain and be remodeled. They're going to do some incidental driveway creation up in front, and then some parking lot, some parking areas and some sidewalks. Some of the utilities will be rerouted and changed from their existing conditions, mainly because the garage is there and we can't span over the top. As far as our project, it's pretty simple. We have gone to DEP. We spoke with Carol. I believe you'll see 4 letters in the file. The first will be from DEP from Carol, which is a pretty favorable letter. The next is going to be from your zoning enforcement officer, Aaron Mannix. Again, when you read that, that's also favorable. And you have one from Kevin McGee that is also favorable as far as the CAM application goes. And the last one should be one from Dennis Johnson, the Director of Health, again, approving the project. So again, we do show all the erosion controls on the plan, which are required. You had saw this about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, the same property for a tear down and rebuild of the house. This is a lot less obtrusive to the site. We're going to be remodeling the house and putting a new garage in. So with that, I'd like to end my presentation. If you guys have any questions regarding the CAM aspect, then I can turn it over to Russ to go over the special permit as far as the house and the rest of the site and the garage.
motion. Why don't we wait on the letters until
Sure.
you guys finish up?
Okay. So again, I'm Russell Campaign from CK Architects, and Mark hired us to take a look and reevaluate how he could improve this particular property. It's a 1900s cottage, fairly unique inside. It's got beautiful exposed Doug fir top to bottom, and they really loved it, bought it because they wanted to save it and work in it. And I think just due to some of the complexity of some of the laws and regulations in this area, was not fully understanding what the previous application required. And after some looking into it a little bit more deeply about the structural requirements and other things, we found and came to the conclusion we actually can work with restoring the existing cottage. And so with that, we sort of started to look at what options would be available to us, associated with that. And so one of the deficits of the existing cottage, and one of the things that working with the existing cottage is it left us with a lot less flexibility as to how to reshape the building on the property and reuse or redistribute some of the lot coverage and other things associated with it. So with that in mind, one of the things that's challenge of the site is that it's very steeply graded on the back of the property. The deck that's on the property is really the only level surface on the property to have outdoor entertainment that isn't in the front yard of the building. The other thing is the way that it's set on ledge, there's really no basement or any feasible storage underneath the property, and there's really, because of the precipitous grades in the back, no place to really store anything on the back side of the building. So he's always had a hard time with just car storage, boat storage, other things that are associated with living on the water, all sort of has to end up in the front. So the garage is kind of the solution that we're proposing to put forward to this. Now the special permit, the 273-37, was very much specifically written for the R1 and R2 zones, which are the shoreline zones. Those two zones in town actually have a 15% lot coverage, which is not only the smallest lot coverage percentage of any of the zones in town, but it's on top of the smallest property lot sizes in town. This particular lot is 15,000 square feet. When you take those two together, the smallest lot coverage and the smallest lot sizes, you make for very, very small ability to work within them and meet the standards of living on the property. So, in reaction to that, I think this 273-37 was specifically written to give some relief to these properties on the shore, and in recognition that certain elements on a property like this aren't as bulky and don't have as much impact on views and other things as buildings do. And so what they did is they specifically wrote it with decks and swimming pools and other low features in mind when they wrote it. And it's an avenue for us to exclude those features from the total lot coverage. In other words, the deck doesn't have as much impact on the bulk of the property than does a building. And so what this does as an avenue is put it to you as a subjective review to allow us some more flexibility to categorize a deck separately from a building. To do that, in this case, the deck is existing, but I don't think that has anything to do with the way that it's written. It still applies to this. So we're asking to categorize the deck lot coverage under the separate 10% lot coverage addition that's available in this special permit application. And that will free up enough area for us to build a garage, a standard two-car garage on the property. In response, and the criteria that's set forward in a special permit is it has to not impact the ability to get septic on the property, which Dennis has written. They actually upgraded the septic and did a repair to bring sort of a high-tech system into this property. So that's been addressed. And then it speaks about views and enjoyment of adjacent properties. And so I think in enjoyments of adjacent properties, I think the ability for us to have the storage and clean up the front of the building is important, to the enjoyment of people walking by and everything. Right now, his front yard is his backyard, and so that's where everything sits. The garage will have the ability to address that and clean everything up. In regards to the views, we've very carefully positioned the garage in front of the existing, maintained the existing view corridor on the south side of the property, which is the regulated one, but we also have completely maintained the view corridor through the property that now exists. And so the positioning of that, I think, we've done purposefully to minimize its impact on any view from the public way. From a vantage point as somewhat of a give back, we are taking off the staircase that comes down on this side of the existing deck, And then we're also proposing in our proposal to change the deck railing out to a less dense type of railing. We're proposing a horizontal cable rail system as opposed to the vertical picket that's there now. So the view that you see through here, you can see the deck and the railings. Obviously, the cable rails will open this up, but it really is an at-grade feature. It's just a deck because the grades fall off toward the water so much. So really, I think we fit very nicely into this particular special permit. I think it was written for this exact case, and I think we've addressed the criteria that you are sort of considering, our proposal on quite well in the way that we've laid this out. There are 3 letters of support, and we've received them from Vaughn Knowles, who's across the street, the neighbor that's on the north side of the property here. So those 2 neighbors have weighed in positively and are kind of on the most affected side. And then there's another letter that is in support, and there's one that's in opposition, but unfortunately it was written anonymously. And therefore, we got it a few days ago, but really could do nothing to try and respond or react to it, to contact them, to try and negotiate anything. So I'm not sure if they're in the audience and would like to step up, but that kind of took any opportunity for us to try and walk through the proposal with them or try and address any of their concerns. But obviously, you'll read them into the records. But one of the main concerns that was expressed was that there's items stored like boats and bikes and kayaks in the front yard of the building, mainly because there really is no backyard. And I think that the proposal of the garage is very much that Mark sees that as an issue that he's embarrassed by and would like to correct it through additional storage on the property to hide all that stuff. So I am open. I mean, I can show the garage is a simple design. I'm not sure how much you want to get into it, but basically it's a simple design meeting the 15-foot height limit that's in this area right now. I mean, I will say that there is discussion about maybe changing that height limit in the future to 20 feet, depending on when we pull building permit and what we do. But right now, it's a fully compliant structure the way it's set up. It will be fully compliant when we build it. When we seek building permit, we're not seeking any variances associated with it. And it sits on a compliant area of the site, as does really every other feature of the property is compliant, except I think there's like a 6-inch encroachment on one of the side setbacks of the existing historic building. So no variances are necessary. So any questions or anything that you'd like to elaborate on?
What's the flood zone?
So the flood zone actually, it doesn't come into the building itself. It sits down. You can see it come right down through here. So we're in an X zone, unregulated zone, where the actual property and all the buildings sit. And so there's no concerns associated with the flood zone in this particular.
Does the house have a basement now, or is there?
It's got an open area underneath. It's on wood piers down right on ledge. And ledge, there's a it's like 6 feet of headroom here, but then very quickly comes up with the slope that's adjacent to it, just a bare ledge that runs up to 0 pretty quickly under there.
Yeah, I did a drive-by and I can see this ledge right where the garage is going to go. Can you just like pour concrete right on top?
Ledge, that's a standard detail. It's actually
You can just pour right on top of that?
good detail. It doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah, and you can just pour the...
You have to pin it so that if there's any frost action on it, it doesn't disturb. So you have to drill, just rebar pins in every.
So it's not like you have to blast the rock?
No blasting. And the well line, which will have to be run around it. There's an existing well line that runs there that is easy to change. And then the overhead line will come now to the garage, the backside of the garage, with a new service entrance as opposed to the main house. In the main house, we're proposing to reclad the exterior, put new windows in. There's a couple minor modifications to window locations and such, but it's pretty minimal. It's mostly a restoration of the existing layout of the building.
There's several letters. Can we read them into the record?
Absolutely.
Alan, you want to grab the first one?
To the Planning and Zoning Commission, Dennis Johnson, Director of Health, January 15, 2020. The applicant's proposed house and rebuilt and garage addition will not add bedrooms or increase waste design flow to the septic system currently existing on the site. Based upon the site plans and septic system design review, it is our recommended that the applicant proposed special permit be approved.
Thank you. There's a letter from the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection to the Planning and Zoning Commission, Town of Guilford, Kevin McGee, Environmental Planner, 50 Boston Street, Guilford, Connecticut. RE Coastal Site Plan Review for seasonal residents on waterfront at 162 Daniel Avenue. Mark Lazarus, applicant. Dear Commissioners, thank you for referring the Coastal Site Plan Review received December 18, 2019 to us for review and comment. Project description: the subject property is waterfront lot of 0.21 acres, which hosts a single-family residence. A new 24 by 26 garage will be constructed with a ground floor elevation of 16.5 feet. The garage will be built within the Zone X outside of the V Zone, which also exists on the property. The driveway will be pervious gravel surface. We commend the applicant for not installing blacktop non-pervious surface driveway, which could potentially adversely impact Indian Cove. The driveway should be pitched to drain to the north and south of the lot and not to the street. Coastal resources on this waterfront site are significant and include rocky shorefront, tidal wetlands, coastal waters, Indian Cove, coastal hazard area, VE-14 and X, developed shorefront and shorelands. Conclusion: we hope that these comments are helpful to the Commission. Pursuant to CGS Section 22A-110, we request these comments be read into the record at the public hearing for this applicant. If we can be of further assistance to you in this or any other coastal management or Long Island Sound-related matter, please feel free to contact me, 860-424-3138. Sincerely, Carol Zemansky, Environmental Analyst. Who wants to grab the next one from?
Do you want to do the staff first and then?
Yeah, do staff first. Go for it.
This one's dated January, it's tomorrow, January 16th, but
We'll call it the
today.
15th.
Yeah, from Kevin McGee, Environmental Planner. Coastal Area Management Review, Mark Lazarus, 162 Daniel Avenue, Guilford, Connecticut, Assessor Map 10, Lot 164. The information provided indicates that the existing house is being remodeled and a section of deck is being removed and a new garage and driveway are being installed. The stormwater management system consists of roof leaders from the proposed garage discharging to a stone energy diffuser and installation of pervious pavers. The coastal resource policies applicable for the property are coastal hazard area, rocky shorefront, coastal waters, intertidal flats, and shellfish concentration areas. The site plan provides for erosion and sedimentation control measures that are designed to protect the adjacent coastal resources. The work being conducted could have an impact on an adjacent coastal resource if the erosion and sedimentation control measures are not properly installed and maintained. In order to make sure that the coastal resources are protected, I recommend the following conditions of approval. 1, the Town of Guilford Zoning Enforcement Officer should be notified to inspect the sedimentation and erosion control measures prior to any demolition or site construction. Soil stockpiles should be contained by silt fencing and/or hay bales. Soil erosion and sedimentation control measures shall be maintained until vegetation is established or suitable material is installed to the satisfaction of the zoning enforcement officer. 2, the site should be inspected daily to make sure that all construction debris has properly been disposed in a covered dumpster. 3, the installation of pervious pavers shall be documented by the site engineer, who shall submit a report documenting the proper installation to the zoning enforcement officer prior to the issuance of a certificate of zoning compliance.
There's also a memorandum to the Planning and Zoning Commission from Aaron Mannix, zoning enforcement officer pursuant to this project. The subject property, 162 Daniel Avenue, is located in a R2 zone in the Indian Cove Association. The parcel is 15,900 square feet and lies within 100 feet of a critical coastal resource. The Commission approved a coastal site plan application for a 10-foot by 20-foot shed in May of 2018 and a coastal site plan application in January 2019 for the demolition of the single-family dwelling and construction of a new single-family residence. At this time, The property owner has abandoned the previous proposal and wishes instead to renovate the existing house and construct a new detached two-car garage. The applicant is before you tonight with a new coastal site plan application and request for special permit per section 273-37, additional lot coverage for certain structures. In the R1 and R2 zones, an additional 10% of lot coverage may be allowed for swimming pools, decks, tennis courts, and similar structures when such additional coverage does not infringe on the primary sewage system or reserve area for said system and is authorized by special permit. In reviewing such a special permit application, the Commission shall consider the impact of the proposed construction on views from adjacent public and private property and on the use and enjoyment of said adjacent properties. Should the Commission wish to grant the special permit application, I would recommend a condition of approval to include 1. Lot coverage calculations shall be included in the A2 as-built survey prior to the issuance of a final certificate of zoning compliance.
A couple quick questions. There's actually a letter here. Are the Schaefers here by any chance? No, all right, then I'll read the letter in. Town of Guilford, Planning and Zoning, 50 Boston Street, Guilford. Restoration and variance request from Mark Lazarus and Sue Keever. To whom it may concern, we are writing on behalf of our next-door neighbors, Mark Lazarus and Sue Keever, owners of 162 Daniel Avenue. We have been informed of the plans to restore their existing home and construct a garage for storage. Since we are unable to attend the meeting, we wanted to express our full support of this project. Restoring their existing home will maintain the integrity and charm of Indian Cove. Sincerely, Jack and Liza Schaefer, 146 Daniel Avenue. The next letter, I want to just get some reference from George. It is addressed to Zoning Board of Appeals and dated March 24th of 2018. So I guess the question is,
Up here?
how did it end up here, and
I don't know the
does
answer.
it apply to us?
It seems they've resubmitted, I guess, the same.
I don't know.
The same letter
Just,
for the shed variance.
just noticed that
If you didn't,
tonight, actually.
Is the shed actually pictured in your drawings there?
It is there.
It is shown on our site
Yeah.
plan.
It
It's
doesn't
actually
come
called out
out
as
of the
code
other one?
27.
Yeah, who submitted that?
I don't know.
It meets all the
It's a little
regulations.
unusual, I'll just read an
Yeah.
excerpt from their letter, if that's okay.
We received this on January 14th in the office, but
But
we
it's
can't
not
really
to us.
remember how we
But it's
got
not to
it.
us.
Correct.
So,
Well,
but for the heck
it
of
was delivered to our office pursuant to this application.
Okay, we live directly across the street from the cottage of Jack Schaefer, diagonally across the street from the cottage of Mark Lazarus. Indian Cove consists of many small lots, and the need for storage space is always a challenge. Jack Schaefer and Mark Lazarus found the best locations on their lots for their sheds. Each gave considerable thought to the placement, and they are tastefully done. We have no objection to the placement of these sheds. So they're relatively in support. As we ask people to state their name and address for the record, kind of have a problem reading an anonymous letter in.
I agree with you.
You know, but just with respect to that, I read through this quickly, and it seems to mostly point toward the storage of boats, et cetera, in the yard, and it certainly sounds like the placement of a garage would do much to alleviate that, so I'm going to leave that at that. Any further clarifying questions from commissioners?
I think if somebody's going to write a letter for or against it without their name, it should not be even read into anything anyway.
I agree with that.
So,
So if you don't you write a letter, be sure you put your name on it. If you're not proud enough to put your name on it, don't bother writing it.
No, or just understand that we're not going to read it in.
can you just clarify for me the existing shed and its orientation to the street versus the garage that you're proposing and its orientation?
So on the site plan, the existing shed is within the zoning setbacks on the northern corner of the lot. And the garage is sort of as close to the setback allows on the southern portion of the lot. This is an image of the shed.
Right.
The way it sits on the property. There's another shed on the other adjacent, that's why that letter
Okay.
referenced two sheds.
I see.
There was an issue, and a variance was sought to actually have it closer, because the neighbor had a better view if it was closer to the lot line than where it had to be placed.
I see.
And it turns out that the variance wasn't granted, and the shed had to be moved in a compliant location to the neighbors.
But in the final design, both sheds are going away?
No.
Or they're staying?
No, the shed stays. So the other shed is not on this property, so, but this shed here is existing, compliant, the coverage all works, everything about it is compliant, and we're proposing to keep that. But it's a small, it's a small shed from a vantage point of fitting boats and larger things in it, or a car, obviously. It's not of that scale
Yeah.
to allow it to really address the need. The other thing before I forget, because Mark, sorry, Mike had reminded me, if we could also ask to waive the second public hearing. There's a lot of information that's been provided, all staff has weighed in, so we'd like you to entertain that as well, if at all possible.
Yep. And just one more item of clarification. I did hear that letter that was read in for ZBA, because I bought the ZBA application in front of ZBA, so that letter was just copied from the last application. Basically, what it was is, again, restating what Russ said, is the shed was closer to the property in order to create better view access. The subsequent application was denied, so we had to bring it into conformance and move it over. So that's what that letter was. So now the shed is in complete conformance with the regulations.
And unfortunately, the other thing we should just mention is, it'd be great to be able to orient it differently on the property, but the existing septic actually has a setback requirement that won't allow it to rotate or change really its location. The site is completely locked down,
Yeah,
kind of.
it's small.
Can you speak to Carol about the driveway sloping away
Yeah,
from the
there's
road?
the last.
Sure. So the question at hand was about the driveway sloping away. The driveway naturally does slope away from the street. I think she was just restating. The way it's graded now, there's a 17 contour in front, there's 16, and then it flows back around this area. The septic system is a mounded septic, and the reason for that is everybody had alerted that there was ledge in the area. So this is mounded up out of the ground, but there is grading patterns that will allow the water to get around and not into the street like Carol wanted.
Town of Guilford, zoning and planning, 50 Boston Street, Guilford, Connecticut, dated January 15th, 2020, regarding 162 Daniel Avenue restoration. To whom it may concern, we are writing on behalf of our neighbors Kimberly Sue Keever and Mark Lazarus, property owners of 162 Daniel Avenue, and their special permit application. We are unable to attend the public hearing that is being held on January 15th, 2020, but wanted to share our approval of their request. Sue and Mark have always acted in a manner that was considerate of their neighbors and respectful of the essence of Indian Cove. The choice to restore their home only further displays their desire to preserve the beauty and integrity of Indian Cove. Best regards, Matthew Buckoff and Ellen Tochkov, 93 Spencer Avenue.
Thank you. Are there any clarifying questions from the audience? Would anybody like to speak in favor of the application? Would anyone like to speak against the application?
So can I propose now or make a motion to waive the second public hearing?
Sure.
Unless you wanted to have discussion.
Well, why don't you make a motion, we can have someone second, then we can have some discussion.
All right, I'll make the motion to waive the second public hearing for this.
Discussion. I think it's pretty straightforward. Most of the abutting neighbors seem to be in support of it, and we have a path to be able to approve this.
You can make the argument.
Usually waive the public hearing. The second hearing, and close the hearing, and then deliberate on the application. Usually vote on the motion to waive first, unless that's what you're discussing. Is
Yes.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
Right, yeah.
I thought you were getting into the substance of the
No.
application.
No.
Okay, excuse me.
It really just had to do with potential objections, so.
I'm sorry.
I was going to say, considering there was already a previous approval to replace the house, this is, and some could argue this is a actually better solution, so with all the checklists being completed, I think that makes sense.
So actually, just for the point of order, seated tonight are going to be Sean, Scott, Rich, myself, then Matt, Alan, and Frank. And you guys are the alternates. So we have a motion, we have a second. I'll call a vote. All in favor of waiving the second public hearing? Aye. Thank you. There is a motion here. Would someone like to read the motion in?
Voted that the Guilford Planning and Zoning Commission approve a coastal site plan and special permit application from Mark Lazarus at 162 Daniel Avenue, map 10, lot 164, as shown on CAM soil erosion control plan prepared for Mr. Mark Lazarus dated 12/16/19, prepared by Harkin Engineering LLC. Lazarus Kiefer, 6 sheets dated December 16, 2019, prepared by CK Architects. The application is approved with the following conditions. I would refer back to the Kevin stipulations of the environmental planner.
Aaron also had here as well.
And also Aaron's one condition. This application is approved based on the finding that it conforms with the zoning code and is consistent with the coastal management policies of the state of Connecticut. The special permit is effective on January 24th, 2020, and upon filing with the town clerk.
Second.
Very good. Discussion?
You did close the public hearing, I'll note.
Thank you. Okay, good. Again, I think it's a good application. I think it meets the criteria. I think it is helpful for the neighborhood.
Yeah, exactly, and I think it goes toward even in property improvement, the storage of the boats in the front yard and things to that.
Maintaining the house as
Yeah.
it was before.
Yeah, what's the original build of the house? What year was it built?
1900.
Oh,
Yeah, I'm assuming they're gonna be doing the exterior too and restoring it, because right now it's kind of lousy siding, so it'll look better and more conforming.
How do you really feel about it?
Yeah, it'll look better to the area.
So we have a motion, we have a second, had discussion. I'll call a vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, moving on, pending applications, because we just did the public hearing deliberation. Robert Mangino, architect, owner, PDC LLC, Boston Post Road, map 78, lot 13, zone TS2, site plan modification to allow for sale of landscaping materials, including tractors and tools, request 30-day extension. Someone like to make a motion to move this to the 19th?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor? Okay. Edwin H. Fisher III, 97 Vineyard Point Road, map 9, lot 1A, zone R5, application for a 2-lot subdivision. Deadline for the application is 2/19/20. What are we looking to do on this one, George?
That has a CAM application associated with it. The public hearing will be next meeting.
Okay, so we'll table
that's
this
just
one
tabled.
to the 19th.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor? Thank you. Horton Group LLC, Bank of America, 916 Boston Post Road, map 47, lot 22A, zone C2, site plan to add and upgrade existing exterior lighting and additional fence along drive-through side of property. Deadline for action is 2/5, so that's our next meeting to be tabled to.
I'm pretty sure you said table to the 19th.
That's what it says on my,
You actually,
No, that's the deadline for
Okay.
action.
just
So we're
ta-
tabling
just
it,
table it.
but we'll
Hopefully
go back
act
to
on
Fisher
the
then.
5th, yes.
we'll
Table
reopen.
Fisher to the 5th.
Second.
Instead of the 19th.
Okay, all in favor of moving to the 5th from the 19th?
Aye.
All right.
Thank you.
Horton Group, I'll table to the 5th. Good for you.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right.
Thank you. Stephen and Maura Mongelli.
This is a new application.
Okay. 100 Orchid Drive, map 94, lot 3A-4, zone R8, special permit for 910 square foot pool house, receive and set public hearing date for 2/5/20.
Second.
Then I get it. Okay, all in favor? Thank you. Just the same thing?
Just can't.
Subdivision application came in initially and was brought to the applicant's attention that a coastal site plan was also needed and was subsequently
So we
submitted the following day, but they could not have been received on the same day.
Okay, so
So-
will we be seeing these together?
Yes, that's the idea.
Yes, that's fine.
Edwin H. Fisher III, 97 Vineyard Point Road, map 9, lot 1A, zone R5, coastal site plan for 2-lot subdivision, receive and set public hearing date for 2/5/20.
So moved.
Have a second?
Second.
All in favor? Thank you. Joe White, 40 Thirsty Lake Road, map 85, lot 57A, zone R5, special permit for attached accessory apartment. Receive and set public hearing date for 2/5. We're going to be busy. Second, anyone? Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Town of Guilford PCC Commission, proposed zoning amendment, section 273-25A, lot area, shape, frontage, interior, lot description. Receive and set public hearing date for 2/19. Okay?
Anybody has any questions regarding what this amendment is? I have provided you with a memo and can refresh your memory on this one.
Hold on, let's just set this. So it's set and received for 2/19?
So moved.
All in favor? So just a point of clarification, the zoning board of appeals is probably 45% of all our applications has to do with this ordinance, and it has to do with existing lots that, when zoning was implemented in 62, did not have enough street frontage, and so have additional burdens placed upon them. So basically what it's proposing to do is, if their lot was created before 62, that they will fall to the underlying zone requirements as opposed to placing the additional burden of interior lot requirements on them. But we'll go through all that on the 19th. And the planning committee actually deliberated this and did a great job on it, and I was at the meeting last night when we went through this, and it's a referral from them. So we shall hear that on the 19th. Other commission business.
Aaron actually developed that elaborate memo that you have. Put credit where it's actually due.
Thank you, Eric.
Well, we did do a good job of talking about it.
That's right. I mean, the whole one-line scratch. But it's good. It's a good solution for now. Other commission business, discussion of planometric summary reports, zoning regulations, and subdivision regulations with Glenn Chadler of Planometrics. Welcome, Glenn.
Excited to be here. As you know, Planometrics was asked to take a look at the zoning and subdivision regulations, come back here with recommendations about how these regulations could be updated, modified, or further enhanced. We took a number of exercises in the fall, talking with the commission, talking with town departments, invited the public, invited architects, engineers, attorneys, and other people using the regulations to give us comments and feedback. And we compiled those.
I don't know. Could you move the microphone closer to you?
Yes, thank you.
Does everyone have a copy, just to interrupt, but do you all have your reports with you, subdivision and zoning, or do we need extra?
Need extras here.
So I think the report's been broken into two components, the first of which is perhaps, let's say, the zoning regulations. That's a fairly lengthy report, quite a bit of material in there. The other one is the subdivision regulations, which is a little bit shorter and more concise. What I'd like to do with your approval tonight is to walk through the subdivision regulation one and then tackle zoning. I think there's a couple of different ways that we could go. I think a number of the comments in here are somewhat consistent. I think the issues have been identified. I've highlighted in the reports things that I think I need to ask you about tonight so that I can go off and do that work. And if there's issues in the reports or the regulations that you've noticed and gives you pause or concern or scares you, or you want additional information on them, we should talk about those. My goal, once the commission has said, given me the direction that I need, is to go off and start working on the regulations, work with George and Aaron to prepare text to make sure I understand the history of everything that's happened in Guilford, et cetera, and then come back to the commission as we move ahead with revised regulations, and perhaps do that one set of regulations at a time, one section at a time. It's generally my practice to prepare the entire set of regulations for my purposes, and that's the way that I know that I'm not losing track of anything in the regulations. I may be moving things around. I think, for example, your waiver provision and the subdivision regulations are at the back, and generally speaking, I think they should kind of be at the front. So to this type of stuff, I'll be able to pledge to you that I've not lost anything, that the material is all in So I'd like to start the discussion on the subdivision regulations, if it's okay with you. I'd like to treat the report as kind of a consent agenda that absent a protest or from the commission or questions or concerns, I'm likely to move ahead with these items. And then again, I've got some issues I would like to raise for get some feedback from you, and I imagine you may have some as well. Does that sound like a reasonable way to proceed?
Great, thank you.
Thank you. So I think on the subdivision regulations, I think the organization of it is not terribly bad. I think things are kind of mishmashed around a little bit. At the bottom of page 2 of the report, I'm going to propose an organizational structure that we sort of set up the basic premise for the regulations. Subdivisions are really a case of what I would call consumer protection laws. They are set up so that a purchaser of a lot in a subdivision knows that the lot is buildable. It's got a septic system that's been approved and authorized. It's got a water source. The road, if there is one, is going to be built and bonded. So they can feel comfortable investing perhaps several $100,000 in a lot and know that the town has approved this lot, the road will be built, and the improvements will be taken care of. So the technical standards in the subdivision regulations are really the key drivers here. Drainage or road construction, open space set-asides, these types of things, utilities. So the technical standards are the main element of this regulation. I suggest we get to that quickly. We then move on to the procedures for a subdivision, and I think the procedures are broken into 2 phases. What does an applicant need to do to come to the commission and get approval? And then subsequent to that, we start getting into the whole filing of the maps, signing of the Mylars, posting of bonds, construction and inspection. And if you don't get approved, you don't even get to that point. So I think it's a logical organization that basically says boom, 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 and boom. This is what would happen.
Have you used this format, so to speak, in helping other towns go through a similar process?
So I used to be, I think I've mentioned to you, Commissioner, before, a town planner years ago, and the regulations that I was using in that community were essentially set up this way with one kind of switch. And it just such a logical and intuitive way that as I went to see other towns and the layout of their subdivision regulations, it kind of confounded me a little bit that it's not a linear process, that you should really sort of walk through this from page 1 on rather than putting your fingers in pages or clicking on your mouse, moving back and forth. So I think a logical, intuitive organization for both the subdivision and the zoning regs is going to go a very long way to helping people visualize and understand the regulations. I think in terms of specific comments and issues, I've laid out the comments based on the possible organization of the regulations. I think the first thing that I wanted to talk through with the commission doesn't happen till page 4. So does the commission have any thoughts or concerns on page 3? I think most of these are just observations and fairly straightforward. Any questions on page 3? So on page 4, again, some questions or comments and some concerns were expressed. People who I'm sorry, go ahead, Matthew.
Well, this is kind of just a question in general about the whole process, but one of the concerns was about compliance with the Connecticut general statutes. Can't we just have like a blanket statement in the regulatory basics section that says something along the lines of, unless otherwise provided, where these regulations are meant to be in compliance with the Connecticut general statutes?
So the regulation, I think there's a language in the event of conflict that the more restrictive applies. But generally speaking, subdivision regulations, the technical standards are primarily local. Zoning gets a lot more involved in terms of the statutory requirements. Here in a subdivision, it's going to be more procedural, that we're going to have to demonstrate consistency and compliance with state law. But I think your observation about in the event of conflict, state law or more restrictive requirement controls. Thank you for that. Page 4. There's a number of comments here with regard to roads and driveways, and I think we have some challenges in Guilford right now in terms of where the requirements exist. We have a road ordinance, we have some driveway provisions. They're not well put together. So I'm planning on talking to Janice to figure out, I think she's working on the road ordinance right now, is my understanding, to figure out the right places for this and coordinate it. So I'll be working closely with George and Aaron on this particular situation. I think comment 25 on page 4, I think there's a provision in the regulations that allows waiving adherence to the road ordinance, or the waiver provision could allow that. And the Planning and Zoning Commission can't waive an ordinance. So if we want the freedom or flexibility, such as, and I think we're going to write in flexibility in the regulations for curbing, for LID and other stuff, provide some flexibility, but we're also going to have to coordinate with the road ordinance. So it's just going to be a little delicate as to how we make sure that these two regulatory, one adopted by the town meeting selectmen and one adopted by the commission, mesh well together now.
Could we update some of the regulations to say something along the lines of that sidewalks are required for all new developments in these zones or something in this particular area? Because I think a lot of people are concerned about sidewalks, and I am in favor of sidewalks for safety reasons, and so I just think maybe new developments should be required to have sidewalks, especially in certain zones that are new residential areas, especially.
Yeah, so I think there's some additional information on sidewalks, I think, as part of my interview process. Yeah, I think there's a group in town working on the issue of sidewalks, et cetera, and one of the things we talked about was the possibility of a map, whether it goes in the POCD or elsewhere, which identifies, or some communities have, I don't call them sidewalk areas, I guess I would call them. So for example, in the center of town, sidewalks and pedestrian accessibility are a large part of what makes the town center as unique and special as it is. You get up into North Guilford, sidewalks are probably not as, but then you get also close to schools and perhaps you could. So to develop a hierarchy, and once that hierarchy is created, the zoning and subdivision regulations can relate to it. So trying to find that happy medium and happy balance to get that in there. So I think sidewalks could exist, provisions could exist in both set of regulations because they're actually kind of doing different things.
Glenn alluded to this committee that's been appointed by the Board of Selectmen, the Safe Streets Task Force, Complete Streets Task Force, I think they're called. It's anticipated that they might come up with a fairly comprehensive set of proposals, some of which would be regulatory, with regard to enhancing non-motorized transportation alternatives in a wide variety of ways. Some of those proposals might be appropriate to the zoning code, some of them might be appropriate to the subdivision code. Whether that work will be done, simultaneous with Glenn's work here, I don't really know. I have a feeling it won't be. I think it'll probably be coming along later. And they're gonna engage a consultant, I know, to help them do that, the task force. So one way to make our job a little bit easier is not to make too many really major changes in the way we regulate pedestrian facilities in the zoning code and subdivision code, and wait to make those changes when we get the recommendations from the Safe Street. I go to their meetings.
You go to the meetings.
Yeah, I'm not actually, I'm not a member, but I do go to their meetings, and so does Janice. So we're definitely going to be plugged into what they're doing.
You report back.
Yes.
Overall question.
George, do you walk to the meeting?
I'm sorry, what?
You walk to the meeting?
I do, yeah.
Sorry, Rich,
Go ahead.
Just another comment on the sidewalks is that the commission in approving subdivisions are limited to requiring off-site improvements as well. And so there are limitations on if a new road is being constructed as far as requiring sidewalks on that new road, but you may not have that authority to require.
I'm talking about comment 57, which is well down the list, we're not quite that far
sorry.
yet, but there is this court case that limits the commission's ability to require off-site improvements, and we're going to be respectful of that as we work on these regulations.
I'm sorry, by way of a general response, partly to Matthew's question, the town Chuck Andrus, our counsel, will be reviewing all of this, and he'll be made available to Glenn to consult anytime he needs to on any of the legal questions that might come up.
That actually kind of brings me to another question I have about the process of how we're going to update the regulations, which is the whole purpose of this. But, so, you know, on the last meeting, we do have a proposed zoning amendment, but then we're also at the same time going through this process to update the regulations and
This
stuff,
proposed amendment is seen as a temporary fix.
Okay. that's
Knowing
what
it's
I
going
was-
to take a little while for this to work its way through, we may get back to that and revise that again and deal with this issue more comprehensively and in a more nuanced way. This is definitely perceived as temporary in order to solve a problem that's right now and building up over the next several months.
I know, Rich, you're trying to ask a question. Let me just jump in for a second. I think it's important for the commission to recognize that we're going to be proceeding sort of on two parallel pathways, that our job is going to be to try to improve and make the regulations as the best regulations we can. You may be chomping at the bit to incorporate something, and you could cherry pick things out and bring them into your current regs, because it could be some time before we're actually done in the process. But if somebody was to submit an application for a reg change or something else happens, you need to process that in accordance with state law, and the commission's actions on that will be considered as part of the overall update. We may chime in, if you will, with regard to that application, and then integrate that in the new regs as we move forward. So we're going to coordinate as we go to make sure this works out in the appropriate way.
Notice a reference to POC a bunch of times. When are we due again for the next one, 2024 or 2000? POC?
I think was it 14 when that was
It was
adopted?
finally adopted, wasn't it?
Yeah, so it's supposed to be every 10 years. So we have a few more years, yeah.
But that's,
I won't be here, probably.
that's still a binding document where any of your regs are really,
The OCD is not binding, it's
I
advisory,
mean-
but it's important and impactful.
in the eyes of the state and everything else, that if you don't have it in place, you're.
It's a guiding document.
It is,
Yes,
thank you, that's a great.
It's a roadmap. I've been on two of them, and
Yeah.
Great.
So the next comment that I have is not till page 5. At this point in time, we've talked about issues related to open space, roads, drive, or report addresses, drainage, utilities, lots, interior lots. There's a question or comment whether or not there were too many subdivisions consisting only of interior lots. Should there be a limitation on this? Now, I'm not familiar with the history of subdivisions in town, but the comment sort of intrigued me. Do you feel that some of the subdivisions have too many interior lots, or do you think you have the controls in place that when they're proposed, or are they okay, or you've had issues with them? Does the commission have any concerns on this issue?
We haven't had a ton of them. I mean, there hasn't been a huge amount of development since '08, so I don't feel like there's an excessive number. I mean,
You know,
we
there's-
certainly haven't seen an excess number of applications.
there's a few with common drives, et cetera, but that's,
Okay. So maybe it's no, thank you. Next comment I have is number 48.
The only thing I would mention is that it's possible that it has been a limiting factor to folks proposing subdivisions. I don't necessarily have any knowledge of whether it has been or not, but it is something that could be looked into, at least for that respect. I know that there was that open space subdivision that came before us. The only way that project works is if it's done as an open space subdivision that would have multitudes of interior lots based off our current regulations. Yeah, they came before us. So again, that's an example of a subdivision that would not work because it would be all interior lots. However, it worked in that case because it's an open space subdivision and they have plenty of flexibility in that. So that's the only thing, is that I wouldn't necessarily dismiss the comment. We should definitely continue to look into it because it might actually be stifling and we just haven't heard from folks about that.
Thank you. Next comment I have is number 48. And so the question in a sense is, I would like to be able to sort of read the tea leaves on whether or not the town of Guilford has a policy for the location of streetlights as part of a new subdivision. Some towns say we're rural, we're not doing streetlights, we don't want them. Other towns, and you can see them from the air when you fly over, are streetlights all over the place. The town that I worked in many years ago had a streetlight policy that said intersections of roads, so that people see where an intersection is, and of cul-de-sacs. And the issue is if you're flying along a street that you don't know, you're going to know, you're lit up at the end, that there's trees in front of you, you can't go any further. To your knowledge, does Guilford have a streetlight policy, or should we discuss with staff, et cetera, on one? Does the commission have any preference on this issue?
Road ordinance, I would think. I don't even know.
I mean, I think a lot of the applications, there's been a lot of sensitivity to making sure that if there is lighting in commercial lots, that to the best of the ability, it's not, it's all, I know, but I'm just saying, I mean, my general sense is people, like, don't want lights spilling out.
Well, wouldn't that fall under the same scenario as the sidewalks, for instance? Whereas you might actually want an overlay where you have certain areas where lighting's more appropriate because of the density, for instance.
Maybe we can kick that one back toward the.
I would imagine that the safety.
If it's anywhere, it's in the road ordinance.
Right.
But we could look into that further.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what I wrote, is we're not clear on what our policy is, so my job is to ask around, try to figure it out, and perhaps either let a sleeping dog lie or come back to you with a specific recommendation.
Perhaps, kick it to the Board of Selectmen and say, do you want to have a commission look into this?
And I wouldn't be surprised if that committee that you spoke of, that's part of what they're looking into as well.
But I think the issue is should streetlights be desired in a situation, you're always better off if you have a policy in your regulations that say we can. So I think that's always an advantageous step.
We have a lot of streetlights in intersections and stuff like that. All that's pretty well covered. I mean,
it is,
you come to an intersection
We
where
have them, we just don't know if there are regulations that say they either have to be there or don't have to be there. So I think that's what we're trying to clarify.
For new subdivisions, we're not going back to retrofit. Would they be required?
Go ahead. All right. Matt, see where he wants to go with it?
We'll start with Janice.
Okay.
Glenn, do you have a copy of the road ordinance?
I do. And Janice is one of my first meetings. Members of the commission, the last comment I have is number 56. And this is to ask you whether or not on a subdivision, do you generally do a continuation of the public hearing on a subdivision for 2 meetings, or is that something that generally occurs with zoning? It's both? Yeah.
I think on the subdivisions, generally we do, primarily because there's always a lot of interest, and it seems that additional information seems to come forth between the first meeting and the second meeting, and sometimes people have conflicts. I appreciate that having 2 meetings is burdensome, but we had situations in the past with respect to other special permits where facts came to light after the meeting that would have probably changed the decision of the commission. But, on the subdivisions, I would say most of them do go to a second meeting because they're pretty complex. Most of the ones that we waive the second meeting are pretty straightforward. And I would say we probably waive 90% of the special permit second meeting requirements.
You only have public hearings for re-subdivisions. So if you were having a public hearing with respect to a subdivision, it would most likely be for a coastal site plan.
Or a special permit.
Or that would trigger that.
Like an open space.
And that would be under the zoning purview. But wearing your planning hats,
So in that
it's
situation,
only
because you essentially have 2 applications before the commission, one is the coastal site plan, the other is the subdivision. Because the coastal site plan, let's say, was being continued, the subdivision would also be, you wouldn't close one and leave the other open in case there was some procedural issue, correct?
Well, it's actually a little more confusing because coastal site plans, while they require a public hearing, they only require 1 public hearing. Only the special permits and zoning amendments require the 2 public hearings. And so subdivisions wouldn't technically require a public hearing, although, of course, the commission can have a public hearing on any application it wants to. But I think the situation that the chairman's alluding to mostly is where we have a special permit authorized subdivision, like the open space subdivision, and that's usually fairly complicated. In fact, the only one we've ever done is very complicated and still out there, pending.
I think we did more than 2 on that.
Yeah, and it's not even at the subdivision stage yet. It's only at the special permit stage.
I think we're going to have this conversation again when we get into zoning, so I think I'm okay here that there's not. Any other issues on the subdivision regulations? I feel I'm ready to get started on these and get going, and I think I've got a pretty good roadmap here from what I've heard from staff and others.
Perhaps with respect to the fee in lieu of,
Donation.
yeah, do we have a specific formula for how we come up with the fee?
Things
That's
that
in the
we'll
state
address in
statutes.
this.
So just, if we can make sure we're
It's,
dead set in terms of how that.
it's the layout of that section that we've tried to address.
Whose responsibility is it to provide like kind of the suggestion of what is supposed to happen? You know, yeah, is it like, are we as a commission encouraged to listen to what the town says, or are we ultimately the ones deciding this? You know,
Yes,
that's
you
kind
are,
of-
you are well,
It's kind of been
it
confusing to this
depends.
point.
when the application comes in and there's going to be open space, in all likelihood, the idea for the open space and the location of the open space is something that's developed at the staff level, usually from the environmental planning side,
Right.
Conservation Commission, wetlands. That's usually where the genesis of the idea of a specific open space dedication comes from. Sometimes it comes from a private organization like the Land Trust, if they're interested in particular property. You know, we start talking about it at the staff level, then we talk to the applicant, and then we try to come up with a plan for how it's going to be proposed. Ultimately, it's up to the Planning and Zoning Commission to make the final decision as to, you know, where the open space is in the plan and how it's going to be deeded or dedicated or transferred. In order for it to be transferred to the town has to agree, and in fact, town meeting has to agree to accept the conveyance of the land. So we also start that discussion informally early on with the Board of Selectmen via the first selectman and the town staff to make sure that it appears likely that the town, Board of Selectmen, and then ultimately town meeting will want to accept it.
Right. Recently, we started getting like memos from, I don't know if it was town staff or who, kind of talking about what they thought the town's desire would be in each individual case, and that does seem helpful in terms of just information.
I think that's channeled usually through the environmental planner. That's the way.
And that criteria is in the open, you have open
That
space
is in there.
criteria and how you choose whether or not it's desirable
Okay.
open space.
I did have one quick question, since I have only been here for a few years. Could you briefly describe the Buttermilk Falls court case?
Was that, imagine there was a rural road and a subdivision was built on it. The town, I believe in the Buttermilk Falls case, required that the old town road, which really hadn't been kept up to snuff, be improved as part of the subdivision across the frontage of the subdivision. And the developer said, whoa, that's your road. I'm not doing anything except connecting to it. And the court said, no, we're going to make you improve it. They went to court, and the court said, no, that's a municipal obligation. The developer's obligation is to build a road in compliance with the subdivision regulations, make sure the intersection complies with sight lines and other things. If there's drainage and other improvements needed at that intersection, that's a corollary part. But going beyond that across the frontage is now becoming dangerous territory. So I don't want to blanket say you can't do it, but I think alarm bells should start going off in that scenario. Oftentimes, as part of an application, you can discuss with an applicant the challenges in the road, et cetera, and work other things out. But I think if you require it and end up in court, you may not prevail. So it's really a limitation on a community's ability to require a developer to make an off-site improvement.
So in that case, it sounds like the town was trying to get the developer to pay for their road improvements.
Correct, and that's the way the court, and I have to say, before the Buttermilk Falls case, it was quite common that towns would do this. And until they went to court, and the court said, no, hang on a second here. Their property line is here, your property line is here, you're asking essentially them for a gift. And once they said it, we all said, okay, yeah, you're right. But, so Buttermilk Falls has been around for a while. It's got to be, what, 15 or 20 years or something, the decision?
Frequently
Was that strictly for subdivisions or commercial development too?
I think the premise of off-site improvements should be an area where you would tread softly. So I think Buttermilk Falls, my recollection of the facts of the case was that it was related to a subdivision of land. But I think the court finding could be translated into zoning issues as well. So I'd urge you to follow your staff's advice and be careful. That's all.
Certainly know if the subdivision's proposing a town road within their subdivision, then we could require whatever we needed to make sure that town, right.
And there's a classic case, a town in Fairfield County that I've done some work in. Their road requirements were really almost silly. So a residential street, I think, was required to be paved 40 feet wide. And I explained to them how silly this was, and they really needed to modify it, and they didn't want to. But while I was working with them on their regulations, a small plane had an engine problem and landed on one of their streets, and they finally got it. But I think the issue is you drive along the streets there, and you walk rural, et cetera, and then you get to this runway. And that's not really rural character in nature, but, so.
You're gone. I know, but a lot of these subdivisions were supposed to be built with the expectation that the town was going to take over the road.
And commercial property in the past, the engineer came to the project, the people who were building these large pieces of property, and asked them to donate money for the roads out in front of their place. And what I understand, almost always, they were willing to do that. And then they would have money in the town fund, in a certain fund, to cover that kind of thing. So if there was roads that had to be done, even though it wasn't directly in front of theirs, the town would have this extra money. And that's what he did. He went to them and said, would you be interested in contributing money because of the high traffic account of what you're going to have on that road? And they most likely would agree with it.
It's like a GoFundMe account.
That was then? That was then?
Now we have online apps for that.
That wasn't then so far away.
Yeah, well, not now though, right?
I don't know. I don't know what the engineer's doing now.
Could the state roads try to require that? And that would be totally out of our say.
They do require it.
Yes, you know.
Right now, it's about $300,000 to widen the road at my cost.
Is that state, is that the office of
DOT.
Is this commercial?
it's curb cut permit?
No, nothing to do with curb cut. Strictly use of the property.
So the state traffic authority, I forget, is it OSTA now?
Yeah.
Is that OSTA is requiring the improvement?
Yes.
So, is it a major traffic generator?
I don't see it
More than
as,
200
but they do.
100,000 square feet or 200 parking spaces? More than,
No, yeah, it's a 2,000 square foot
No, so
building,
it's
adding a drive-through.
it's a traffic volume, so it's probably a curb, okay. So what we just had a quick side conversation on there is anytime you need access to state highway, you need approval from the state to have a curb cut permit or whatever. There's two levels of permits. The one is what happens at the district level, unless it gets shot up to headquarters, and that's for the actual curb cut itself. And then they have this thing called the Office of State Traffic Authority, or whatever they call it. It used to be STC, State Traffic Commission. If it's a large development with more than 100,000 square feet or 200 parking spaces, or Lime Rock Park or Lake Compounds, which doesn't really have square feet or et cetera, you need a special review, and they require you to do detailed traffic studies and track your impact out, can be miles. And that's in fact where you can start to get into situations that maybe the turning lane is needed that wasn't needed except for your project. And that's where it can get expensive. So the state gets to do that. The town, I think if we have a documented safety concern on a municipal roadway, that a traffic turning lane was required, I would say that you have the ability to have the applicant resolve that issue. If they do not resolve that issue, I would urge you to deny the application. So you're not necessarily making a condition of approval, you're telling the applicant he has to resolve this safety concern. So it's just, I think when we're doing this, it's just, that's the way you have staff. Tread softly. I'm good with subdivision, I'm ready to go on to zoning.
Great.
I will hang in here with you as long as you would like to. It's not a short report. If we, I don't have a tremendous number of issues in here, but I realize that there's 16 pages worth of stuff. So if at any point you cry uncle, certainly go ahead and cry uncle. I do think, starting on page 2 and 3, the organization of the current regulations really is a major challenge in terms of understanding the regulations. I had thought I had seen it in the table of contents, but as I started to get into the regulations and really look at it, it's very challenging. And what happens in a situation like this is somebody has to essentially, who's not familiar with the regs, has to read every page to make sure they didn't miss something. And that includes staff or anybody or applicants, et cetera. And so I think if we can lay them out in a more consistent and cogent way, it will help significantly. The possible framework here is described on page 3 of the regulations. There will be more chapters than these, but they'll be organized around 4 main themes, the first of which is the regulatory framework. This is probably 4 to 8 pages up front that just kind of sets the stage for the regulations. Then we have this whole section on zones and uses. Now, what this means is that every piece of land in Guilford has a zone to it. People generally own a piece of land and want to know, what can I do with it? And this gets them to that information as quickly as possible. Did some work with the town recently, and they said, you know what? Take all of that regulatory framework stuff and the definitions and put it at the end. We want somebody to get into the zones and uses section within 4 pages of the regulations, and that's what we did. And so we can do this in a way that gives people easily the information they most generally seek. The next major section of the regulation relates to standards. These are things like signage, parking, landscaping, illumination, drainage, all the other stuff that when they're actually preparing a plan. If somebody's building a deck, they probably don't need this stuff. Maybe erosion and sediment control they would, but you know, these are sort of generally applicable stuff. And then at the end, you get to the procedures. This is what you have to do to get a permit to build. And I think this, again, is a logical framework and people understand how it works. We're going to set up a numbering system that allows it to be expandable in the future. I think general code publishing, which the town has used for their ordinances for some time, had their fingers in the zoning regulations, and they use this article section, and it really doesn't allow for new things to be inserted easily, and I think that's a bit of a problem. So we're going to be changing the numbering system on you, but we're going to try to make that easier and more straightforward. Into the specific comments and issues that were identified on page 4. There was a comment number, this is user friendliness and wording and trying to make everything as clear as possible. Comment number 22, we do have this thing in Connecticut law now called the McKenzie issue, which is a town in Western Connecticut wrote their regulations in a way that allowed them to waive any regulation at any time for any reason. Flexible. Very flexible, right? Very user-friendly. But of course, came a situation that somebody didn't think that was right or fair, and it went to court, and the court said, no, you can't do that. The ability to grant waivers rests with the ZBA. But there are ways that you can actually put flexibility into your regulation. There's 13 instances where you have the word waive or waiver in the regulation, and so we're going to go through and fix those for you to make sure that those work well.
I had one question. It was town staff, number 7. I just wasn't clear as to what was meant by the use of hierarchical structure.
So I would say that the general code processes articles and then sections, which are consecutive, really provide no ability to insert something new later. And that's why I think in the Guilford regulations, all the zoning districts that all these new zoning districts ended up sort of getting tacked on to the end. Transition service districts, C4 West, then open space subdivisions got tacked on, then agriculture got thrown in at the end. And these are not places you would expect to find them. They're not related to other topics which are similar. So as a result, they go to the end. And for us, because we're familiar with the regs, it's
you know where to look, but for the average person who's trying to figure things out,
not helpful at all. So as a result, this becomes like a black book to them, and they're afraid of it and they're scared of it. And I think let people understand what they can or can't do with their property, and I think it's all good. So hierarchical structure would create a situation where new things, new ideas that come along, autonomous vehicles, we need regs on autonomous vehicles. Boom, you'll know where it needs to go, and you'll have the ability to insert that in the future. So hopefully make it modular.
I was impressed with number 23.
Staff didn't like that too much. Because I think the issue is,
Number 23?
because discretion can be helpful at times, but then if you get challenged on your use of discretion, if people didn't like your use of discretion, the staff, you feel like you're hanging in the breeze. So I think to the extent that we can provide guidance and standards and say, yes, staff can approve this under these scenarios, it also avoids the sort of McKenzie waiver issue as well. So.
Commission to have discretion. I mean, that's why we're here.
Correct. But giving discretion to staff.
Well, I agree, they should have some discretion to handle.
They should, but they can also feel uncomfortable that they're left hanging in the breeze.
You could also argue that our regulations say discretion of the commission probably more often than they necessarily need to as well. Which is why this is probably a comment.
So there was an observation, number 25. Does Guilford require too many special permits? And I haven't gone through and done an audit of your regulations yet. Do you feel that, let's do the three bears, the number of special permits that you receive and process, are they necessary? Or do they give you the control that you want or need? Or could we turn some of these into site plans? What's your sense?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because when I guess, interviewed for this role, one of the concerns was that we granted too many special permits. So that's kind of the flip side of what you're saying is, do the regulations require special permits, whereas this person was conveying to me kind of like, whoa, on the special permitting. So I'm just curious about that.
For most laymen in town, special permit sounds like someone's getting special treatment.
I think it's more
Where the
check
regulations
on-
just have not kept up with the realities
I think
of
it's
the
a
needs of the
check on
town.
making sure that things are being done properly and that public input is being received and that the project is not if it's not by right.
So one of the interesting things is I agree with the perception. I think it is poorly named. When it's called a special permit or special exception, people think that somebody else is getting special treatment. They think it's like the concierge. And the issue is, what other states call it is a conditional use permit. And what that does is it leaves the impression now that these are uses or activities that are permitted under compliance with certain conditions. So it's actually a little bit more rigorous than a site plan. So we would, in the definitions section of the regulations, because the Connecticut statutes refer to special permits and special exceptions, but we could use the terminology in Guilford. Conditional use permit, special permit is defined as, or conditional use permit is defined as a special permit. So we can use the terminology we want. So let me.
Are we just hiding the names?
Well, I think the important thing for user friendliness is to make people realize and understand that this is not a God-given right. A special permit is a conditional use. You have to demonstrate you meet the conditions to get it. And so I think if people think that, again, a special treatment, we can kind of deal with that. That's one issue. The other issue is whether or not some towns are moving towards a new concept in zoning called form-based coding.
What did you say, form?
Form-based coding. And I would say that Guilford, like many communities, has a system which we would refer to as use-based coding. We use the regulations to say these uses are okay in these districts under these standards. A form-based code pays very little attention to uses, or much less attention to uses, but it defines the building form and type very specifically, architecturally. It says, look, it's a beautiful building. We don't care if you put an office in it, we don't care if you put a retail store, we don't care if you put residences in there. It's form-based. And so a form-based code, in jurisdictions that tend to use it, never even gets to the commission. You define what you want, and staff approves it, and the buildings get built. So the issue of a special permit, you think about the levels of permits, is the commission has the ability to regulate things. And sometimes commissions can go overboard a little bit and say, you know, you want to put a birdhouse out, that's a special permit. It's like, well, what do you mean? But, you know, it's a worry that something's going to slip through the cracks. So I think at this point in time, not quite sure how to respond to this comment. I think we can start thinking about these as conditional uses. I think as part of this review and discussion, if we look at things, we can ask ourselves this question again in the future and say, are these things in the right boxes? Once we list them out, you may look and say, you know what, maybe we could move this over to site plan, or actually move some of the site plans over to special permits, but we can recalibrate that as part of this process.
Recalibration would be good. I think in general that we do have too many special permit conditions where you need a special permit to get things done, where I don't think it should be necessary. That's my opinion.
I'm on to page 5. Anybody have anything else on page 4? So comment 46 is sort of an interesting one. You do have kind of a funky definition of an accessory building. And it seems designed to prevent sort of a specific case or situation that sort of defies logic.
The author of that particular one.
You are?
No.
Oh.
Walter.
So it's just an interesting situation. I'd like to kind of take a look at it a little bit more closely and come back to you with perhaps some suggestions on. But I think it's kind of an interesting situation that may not be a good long-term policy for the town of Guilford.
Can I just go back just a few numbers to 42 and 43? Because
Of course.
I think that those are not small items, given what we encountered with you all.
Doesn't happen all the time, but yeah.
Doesn't happen all the time, but...
So what
It was
happened
a
with
big
you
one.
all?
It became, I think, an element of the lawsuit that was brought against them to stop.
Is this lawsuit still pending?
Yes.
So
It wasn't the only one.
let's talk a hypothetical
It was just
situation.
one of the elements, and it was because the site had been, the state had moved paving debris into, onto the site, years before, and then it was graded. So was it, what was the grade to determine?
And therein lies part of the problem. So I think the first time I had the occasion to work for the town of Guilford was probably 15 years ago, George, the Smart Growth Strategies report. This is one of those issues we looked at, and to my knowledge, I think Guilford's the only town in Connecticut I'm familiar with that measures building height from pre-existing grade. And what I discovered was what was happening. When houses were built many years ago, the depth of a house, based on lumber and other things available, was about 24 feet. Okay, that was this typical house. And as lumber and other building construction got better, the houses started to get deeper, 30, 40, so you get some deep houses now, right? And what happens is the roof pitches have gotten steeper. So the only way that people could get houses in Guilford to comply with the height regulation was to excavate the site out. And you say to yourself, what? We're moving thousands of cubic yards of, hundreds, thousands of cubic yards of dirt because our height regulation? Because it doesn't matter the house was built 100 years ago, what the height was 110 years ago. We're looking at it today. And the way and I think the reason we measure building height and regulate it is to understand the height, bulk, massing of the house and how it relates to its neighbors and the public health, safety, and welfare. So I think what we need to do is figure out how it relates to site work, earthwork, and the actual finished structure when it's done and get a reasonable number that works. Measuring it for pre-existing grade, it's kind of if people are digging sites out, I mean, what do you do? Because we're in a coastal area, right? So what's going to end up happening in terms of, so I think it's something we could and should look at the measurement of building height, understand what the industry is doing, and make sure we have good regulations in effect. Some years ago, I did some work in a town in Fairfield County where they were ending up with building heights which were quite significant because as houses were getting deeper and the roof pitches were getting steeper, the ridge of the roof was getting quite high. They measured mid-height between the ridge and the eave, and they kept it balanced. So they would draw the eaves down while the ridge went up. And you ended up with some really kind of crazy buildings. So the issue ends up being how to adjust this for building height and pitch, et cetera, to get an appropriate result when we're done. I don't think we're talking about three-story buildings of 40, 50, 60 feet. No. What we want is something that fits. But measuring it for pre-existing grade is I think, one of those anomalies we have in town, a little bit like interior lots. There's a regulation adopted in, 1962, that somehow just doesn't really kind of fit, and this could be another one that may not.
How would you even define a pre-existing grade? I mean, if you talk geologically, it's been changing all the time. So at what date do you go back to determine what a pre-existing grade is?
That's part of the problem. I mean, and the best source we might have for something like that is USGS topo maps, which really the level of accuracy is really not good enough for stuff like this. So you have to have accurate mapping, and I know of a situation in eastern Connecticut where somebody knew that they were going to be building a house 3 or 4 or 5 years, and they went and took down all the trees and graded the site the way they wanted it, waited 3, 4, or 5 years, and then said, hey, that's pre-existing.
Part of the concern is people bringing in substantial amounts of fill and then going up from there.
I understand. And that's a grading issue, and the commission should have the ability to regulate and manage what happens in terms of the amount of fill imported, and so special permits and other stuff. So we can look at that.
And it makes sense to regulate as to what you said, conforming with other surrounding buildings. Is it going to be precipitously higher?
Well, I think that Phil brings up a good point. What the issue is that if people are going to be bringing in fill, they're going to have negative impacts on their neighbors and other things around them. That's something that we definitely want to carefully manage. But I'm not sure that this solution didn't cause perhaps some other issues. And
We just had that problem with you all.
Yep.
You were just
Anything to add with that? My question is we have floor area ratios for residential dwellings, and yet we don't necessarily address number of stories. And sometimes just that sheer volume of, a walkout in the front and things like that, those could be proportional with height and.
so you do have a floor area?
For residential, which to me is a little unusual. I don't know if other towns do that.
Some work on that
I would
with Madison,
think
and I
for
think it worked out
commercial.
well. So I think the question.
I think that might, you should look at that as well.
Well, I think.
Sidewalks is counted, garages aren't counted, like, they are.
Right, unused spaces are not, but it's living space.
See that? Okay, so I think what we need to, we're going to.
Come back for like a future permit to finish your basement or you finish your attic, now you have to go back and calculate.
So the question is, why do we have a lot coverage regulation? Why do we have a building height regulation? Why do we have a floor area regulation? It's all related to managing building bulk in proportion to the scale of the lot. So the situation, I hadn't really realized till Russ described it here tonight, 47337, it sort of clamps down on the building coverage in R1 and R2, but it gives you another 10% for things like pools and decks, which are low scale. So as a result, it's an elegant approach in a small lot area to addressing that unique problem of views and other stuff. So it's actually kind of a neat regulation. But we use often these regulations to deal with things related to building bulk and size. But if floor area regulation is not counting certain types of floor area, I know of a town that calculates basement floor space as part of the floor area ratio. You can't see it. You don't know if it's there or not. So why does it get into the regulation at all? So if we're going to use it for building bulk and mass and scale, then let's use it for that and have people make trade-offs in terms of, as in the application you heard this evening. The certain amount of coverage they had, we're going to allocate it, and they made the decision to keep the house and add a garage. That's a reasonable choice. So let's figure out what that could or should be. I think the next comment I have is on page 6.
I have one other about hardship. Should we have a definition of hardship? That came up, it was number 44.
Yep.
I brought that up briefly when I was talking with Chuck Andrews today.
Yep.
And he said that his recommendation is that that's kind of a fine line, where state law statute should be interpreted by courts and not necessarily in the commission's hands.
I understand. I think the issue that, the conversation where this came up was the fact that the concept of hardship is not easily described to people. And they think that hardship is, again, like a special permit or something. What is hardship? Oh, it would really be a challenge for me to have to do it. No, that doesn't work. It has to be hardship related to the land itself. So it's not meant to be a prohibition or limitation. It's meant to be an explanation to even abutters. Your neighbor's not asking for something which is unreasonable. Well, maybe they are. But the issue is that it should be defined this way. So it's not meant to be a limitation on the ZBA. It's meant to be, and it could be a descriptive box in the text rather than a definition. So I'll talk to Chuck about that. Okay. Thank you for that, though, Aaron. So page 6, I think the issue of interior lots, this is comments 56 through 61, is kind of an interesting one. It seems to me that interior lot is a challenging phrase because there's really sort of two types of lots that are often created. What we would call front lots, lots that have frontage on a street, and lots to the back of that are rear lots, they're sometimes called. So an interior lot is kind of, the way it's defined, is an amalgamation in Guilford of a non-conforming front lot. It has frontage on the street, it just didn't have everything it was supposed to have. And now we've penalized it with these other standards. And I think it could have been the original intention back in the 60s was to say, look, if you're a back lot and you don't have a public road access in some way, shape, or form, well, you need to have more area, bigger setbacks, and other stuff. So one of the things for us to kind of think about is to perhaps segregate non-conforming front lots from rear lots, which are interior lots. But this is an area I'm going to have to do more research and work with George and Aaron on to understand exactly. I mean, Aaron came up with the definition, and George from 62, I think it was, and that was helpful. But you know, there's history that's gone on here, not just history when it was created, but we've had.
Not how lots were approved as well. There have been open space subdivisions that were approved with private right-of-ways that are now private roads, but they actually cut through properties as a right-of-way, and all of those are considered interior lots. So some are specifically designed as interior lots, while one question would be if you want to continue interior, that definition or that description of an interior lot, or perhaps create a rear lot, a flag lot essentially, where you have a legal access way.
You're right up. There was a big difference between, look at Fair Street versus Wampus Road. They're a big difference, but they're all considered interior lots, right? Mm-hmm. By the definition. Which makes no sense.
Well, it's not a definition. That's the other problem. We don't have a definition of interior lot. We have a description. In 1962, the regulation was a definition. It wasn't in a definition section, but it clearly stated that an interior lot was defined as.
Had to have the following requirements, and if not, it was then placed as an interior lot. Is that right?
Right. Yes. Well, it was that they could be created as long as they met certain criteria, the oversized lot, the increased setbacks, the legal access way across through the intervening property. So they did have specific criteria. I think as time has passed and the interpretation of that, I think when you look at a strict interpretation of what an interior lot is now is.
I think I recognize from talking with Aaron and George on this issue that it's going to require a little bit more investigation on my part as to what happened and now it's how it's translated over the years. But as I keep reading that definition, it occurs to me there's a functional difference in zoning between a front lot and a rear lot, and we've thrown in I could have a lot from 1600s, I guess, in town, or 1700s or whatever, that just doesn't have the required frontage. And under your definition, I'm now an interior lot, and I'm punished for setbacks and everything else. The issue is, no, it's just the pre-existing non-conforming lot. So it should have the same setbacks as everybody else on the street. It shouldn't be having greater ones. If you're in the back, you don't have public road access for public safety and other reasons we might want to have greater setbacks, larger lot sizes, lower densities, et cetera. So let me get into this, and I think I would encourage you to move ahead with the fix that staff has developed for the commission's consideration, and let us continue to work on this in the back. Comments 62 through 71 were another number of comments with regard to housing affordability and diversity. Would the commission like me to tackle any of this in terms of specific approaches?
Can you enlighten me as to what incentive housing is?
Sure. So, historically in Connecticut, most developments would get built and housing was all market rate. The state in 1989 adopted the Affordable Housing Appeals Procedure that said that for any town in the state that doesn't have 10% of its housing stock categorized as affordable housing, then you are subject to the Affordable Housing Appeals Procedure, which means a developer can propose an application which doesn't have to comply with zoning, and the burden shifts to the commission. You have to justify why you might have turned it down. And the courts are pretty strict on this, that if somebody's going to do an affordable housing development, then
Your town has less than 10% that is considered affordable housing.
Correct. Yes, that's what the criteria is. So that situation, when it was first enacted, a developer had to provide 20% of his units as affordable. Now the standard is up to 30% of those units. An incentive housing regulation is a situation where a community can adopt a lower affordability threshold at 20%, and the state gives you the ability to craft very flexible regulations. There are no claims of spot zoning. There's no you have broad legislative authority to do almost anything you want to create affordable housing that fits in Guilford, and the state gives you a blessing. The reason it's called the Incentive Housing Program is because when it was first proposed, the state was making bold statements about incentive payments to municipalities who adopted this regulation. As it turned out, I think Old Saybrook got 20 grand, and that was about it. Nobody else did. So that's where the name comes from. But realistically, I don't think the state will ever do that. But I do think it provides an opportunity for Guilford to craft regulations which are creative and...
I guess I would be concerned, I don't want you getting tied down too much in this because it has the potential, because it's a pretty big change.
Well, I know the Board of Selectmen has an initiative going on, if you might want to inquire what they're doing. There's one.
Oh, that's the Woodruff?
Yeah.
Woodruff,
Project.
yeah.
There's one set to go.
So I think at this point in time, based on the feedback from the commission so far, I will reorganize the provisions that we have in the current regulations. I will await further instructions from you before I go too crazy with regard to this.
It seems very similar to the open space provision, though. I mean, it's pretty much a similar thing, similar.
You're talking about the incentive housing?
It's affordability is
It's
the
using
clear
affordability as the
difference.
reason for
I
providing
think
flexibility
one
as opposed to
solution,
open
though,
space.
is to let sleeping dogs lie. What we have, we'll continue, we'll organize properly, and as a separate project, we'll look at other vehicles for encouraging affordable housing development.
Sure.
We actually have an incentive housing zoning code that we wrote because the state gave us some money to do it. We never proposed it to the Planning and Zoning Commission, but we could anytime. So I would say, let sleeping dogs lie.
Thank you. And if that discussion decides to resurrect itself, you can, yep, good. Bottom of page 6, the question about accessory apartments. Does the commission have any desire for me to muscle around with the criteria for accessory apartments?
Substantial changes with respect to the regulations on accessory apartments over the last 5 years. We eliminated the necessity of the building to be pre-existing. If it's a detached building, we allow new construction to have accessory apartments. I think we've become a lot more flexible in terms of the types of different units that can be approved.
Good.
Especially, I don't know, I think there's been a lot of thought put into it in recognition that they're very helpful.
Top of page 7, the whole issue about residential open space developments and planned residential developments. I think the record keeping on this is becoming challenging in terms of setbacks and other things that apply. So there have been some suggestions about perhaps having an alternative setback determination, which is the setbacks that are most related to a lot of its size or the zone of its size. And that might address some of the issues related to planned residential developments and open space subdivisions. There was a comment number 78, which is in the POCD. It recommended or suggested that the open space development could become the default subdivision pattern in town. Commissioner, have any thoughts on that?
Discussed that when we did it, our so-called planning committee.
Yeah.
I think we basically scrapped that idea.
Is that legal?
I know towns that do it.
I don't think we want to mess with that right now.
Yeah.
My opinion.
I would suggest that, or at least maybe look at on the PRDs where they're, small, fairly insignificant changes that are being requested, to potentially find a mechanism where that can be approved by town staff as opposed, to going a complete site plan revision.
So there were some comments in here that the process and mechanics of seem cumbersome. So I will see if I can simplify the process while still respecting the regulatory provisions that are in there today.
I'm sorry, are we looking at the actual open space subdivision section as well? I think we definitely have some staff recommendations.
So I think
having
I'm gonna
gone through that process now and what seems where our hands are tied in the review and things like that.
So I think as part of the next step process, I'm going to start to play around with these things, and I think I'm going to be in regular communication with you guys in terms of issues and possible solutions, et cetera. So a couple of comments here in terms of setbacks. I think number 92. So some communities allow a yard exception of a few inches if you're going to put insulation on a historic house or whatever, that, you normally have to meet the yard setbacks, but if you're going to be insulating a house, how do you insulate it, right? Depending on how the studs are, you either got to take space out of the inside or you can actually wrap it on the outside. So the issue would be if zoning is preventing you from doing that because you have to get a variance and claim hardship, you can't necessarily make an energy improvement. But if it's just an issue of a couple of inches, it may be a way that we could enhance energy efficiency and encourage houses to be renovated, et cetera. So is that?
I don't recall it. You've been around a lot longer than I. I've never seen something like that.
No, I heard about this from the couple of the meetings that I ran in town. I know of other towns that do this, and the issue is that the reason people give up on it because the regulations don't allow it, and it's hard to get a variance for it, so they don't ask for it.
Well, we just wouldn't want to discourage it if someone wanted to do it, and it was a couple of inches, and it represented an increase in housing stock that's energy efficient.
It could be. So, I think I can craft it, and the commission can look at it and decide if that's something that you think makes any sense or not.
Yeah. Would that fall under our protections?
I think I'd put it in a different place, Aaron.
Okay.
It's a...
We have run into that.
You have?
Yeah, and it's both lot coverage and stuff. But, it's looked the other way.
Like on downtown properties, smaller lots.
It's going to be a higher density.
Certainly a smaller lot or house that was built.
It's a lot easier to insulate and much more consistent. The insulation is much more consistent to do it on the outside.
Sure.
And, so deep energy retrofits on historic homes, are the best way to address old homes. Very popular, like Boston area and such, all the zoning codes recognize that. But, we're going to wrap the house that I just showed you with 4 inches of exterior, and that luckily didn't cause a setback issue, but we did have to include it in the lot coverage by the way the definitions are. So in a sense, it discourages.
What is that, a solid home insulation?
On the outside?
They can move the windows out there?
Yep. You don't have to. A lot of times they box the windows and put an exterior extension jam.
So that doesn't affect your vapor barrier line, which is to the interior, right?
It'd be a lot of different places. A lot of times you actually use rock salt on the outside, and your weather barrier stays where it used to.
Just for 9:30, is that a good time?
We just have two other little pieces of business, but if we could.
So I think, let me just take a.
I've got 10 minutes left on the tape, so if you want to go till that.
Okay, tell you what, let's get to the bottom of page 7.
Okay.
I don't have too much more here. Comment number 93 is kind of an interesting one. Guilford has a situation where front yard setbacks vary depending on street type. So a street categorization can be changed, and a house that was built in conformance now becomes non-conforming. Some towns, so that it becomes a little bit of a kind of a head scratcher as to how you deal with this. And what happens if there's a vacant lot on a street? Some towns allow a house to be built either in conformance with the setback requirement that exists, or if the house is on either side, you can build your house at the average of those two. So in other words, as you're driving along the street, you don't suddenly have a situation that the front yard setback changed and the house is way back. The issue is you can maintain the integrity. I think.
If you're driving down Fair Street, for example, where a lot of the houses are fairly close, you would then figure out a situation to keep them more consistent.
The town that's done this well, for example, I think this is the first place I saw this was Wethersfield, one of the most historic towns in the state. And the issue is they had this situation where almost a gap tooth type of look, if you will, to the streetscape. But you allow them to modulate the houses based on where the existing houses are, and they can kind of fit in better. So it's an option, if you will, for houses in this type of situation. So in
Where we have that in here somewhere.
I didn't see it yet, George. So.
You have to search it on the
Okay,
PDF.
so hang on, no peeking, but we'll talk at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, and we'll see who finds it first. All right. Is there anything else here? So the comment number 95 was an interesting one. If we have limited coverage in the R8 zone, if a lot was a pre-existing lot, they're still limited to 5% coverage. And so that could be, it does. So, I mean, there's a couple of different ways to deal with coverage. So the current way is we set it across the entire zoning district irrespective of lot size. And the other way to do it is to base the coverage on the actual lot size, so that it's always in proportion or scale. So I'm not quite sure what the answer is, but let me rethink this one, because I like what you guys did in 37, right? The regulation that came up here tonight, you said, okay, well, you can get more coverage by special permit. And maybe we could look at something like that as well. Yeah, the comment came up. I don't know what to do with that one. What's your thought? Yep.
Well, so that example of Russet Drive would be an example of that. That's a private road. They're all considered interior lots. Yet they all look like they're fronting on a road. They all have 50-foot setbacks. And that was an open space subdivision, how that was done.
So what do you do today? The setback is the setback? The front yard is measured from the
Front property.
where it gets its access from. So there's no difference between how you measure setback on a public or private street at the present time in your regs?
I can't say for sure, because there have been so many different ways of approving. People have, access drives, which would essentially be a driveway, could access 7 houses that used to be allowed in subdivisions, and now we limit the number of houses off a driveway, and those could be considered private roads, yet those are all interior lots.
So I think my,
On a case-by-case
let me get, I've
basis,
got
I have to look
enough
at-
feedback here from the commission that and it sounds like you're going to be busy for the next little while. I listened to all the public hearings, et cetera, that you were scheduling. So I have enough information to get started on the subdivision regulations, excuse me. I have enough information to get started on the regulatory basics of the definitions, et cetera, cleaning all that stuff up. So I have enough to keep me busy for a while. I will coordinate with George and Aaron when to come back to chat with you, and we'll pick up at the top of page 8. My role, I think, with the commission will be with staff. You guys need to familiarize me with these situations you've been having that, in town. Say, well, we're struggling with this, and then I can figure that out. So I'll be making field trips to come down and visit. Thank you very much for your help, and I'll see you again soon.
What do we have, 3 minutes, Peter? Okay, so let me just handle a couple of quick business items. One is the appointment, I'd like to call for a vote for the appointment of Bill Freeman to the Planning Commission. Bill's resume and letter, or the committee, sorry, is in our packet. I met with him last night. He's got great experience. Do we have to call for a vote, or just?
I think that's something you do as chairman.
I just appoint him?
Yep.
You're the boss.
Without objection.
Without objection, I'll appoint him to the.
No objection.
Thank you very much. There are bills in the amount of $78.11. Someone like to make a motion to approve?
Pay it. So moved.
Did I get a second?
Second.
Please pay the bills. All in favor? Aye. I read the minutes and they appear to be substantially correct. Would someone like to either object to that or?
I concur. I move that we approve.
Good. Second, anyone?
Second.
Great. All in favor? With no, do we have any further business? With no further business for the commission, we have a motion to adjourn. Second?
Second.
All in favor? Thank you.
One more thing, Mike.
You did it. You did it. Just in time.